one thing are the nuclear weapons that at least are somewhere on military sites. But there's also lots of industries that feed this nuclear weapons complex and that have nuclear fissile materials on site or technologies, all of which have to be protected. And there were hundreds such sites through former Soviet republics that all of a sudden were not protected properly. I believe with regards to the danger that nuclear materials or technologies could fall into terrorist hands, this was the most critical period so far in history.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. You might notice this episode is in your feed at an odd time of the month. That is because when recording, my guest and I discussed events in Ukraine. In order to make sure you had this information as quickly as possible, I rushed this episode through production. However, you can listen to it at any point in time. Today is Wednesday, March 2nd, 2022. Russia has attacked Ukraine. President Putin has put his country's nuclear forces on high alert, and Belarus has reaffirmed its offer to host Russian tactical nuclear weapons. And today, my university hosted an expert from the American Physical Society's Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. One of their project team, Matthias Grosse Perdekamp, traveled from the physics department at the University of Illinois to speak to us about nuclear threat reduction. While here, he agreed to be on the podcast. And I thought it would be important for you to hear what a physicist had to say about nuclear war, nuclear treaties, and what is happening in Ukraine. So what I wanted to talk to you about is your membership, the APS Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me what this is, what the coalition is?
Yes, the coalition is a relatively new effort by the American Physical Society to re-engage physicists in an effort to advocate to Congress to take measures that would reduce the nuclear threat. I think this kind of grows out of the history that the physics community in the United States has that advocated historically very strongly for arms control and tried to inform the public and also our political leadership with regards to the dangers that come along with nuclear armament. But in the aftermath of the demise of the Soviet Union, I think this became less acute and people stopped doing this. But this certainly does not mean, and I think we currently look at the crisis in Ukraine, that the threat is not there. It may be as acute as it was ever before. And so the APS was looking for ways to re-engage the physics community. And it collaborates on this with the Carnegie Corporation and the Princeton Institute for Science and Global Security. I think the APS got a grant that supports this effort. And so it's a few people at the APS who now work initially with what's called a project team of physicists who go out and give colloquia and talks that aim to recruit members into the coalition. Presently, I think we have 800 plus members, so people can sign up. And then this is used for grassroots activism, so letter writing campaigns, op-eds, congressional visits, this sort of thing.
So 800 members, how many, I mean, there are about, like 40 or 50,000 APS members?
I think it's at 40,000. Mm-hmm.
And are all of the 800 members, are these all members of the APS, or are they outside the APS as well?
I think they're also outside the APS. So presently, what the coalition is saying, any physical scientist and engineer can be a member. And not all of the members are in the APS. I recall, for example, one of my recent colloquia was at UNM, And in addition to the physics department, I also talked to the nuclear engineering department. And I think the majority of the new members or that joined after this visit were from the engineering department.
Do you see a range of ages of the members of the coalition? Do you know, does it trend more young, or is it kind of all over the place?
I think it's all over the place, but I also believe that there is significant interest from students, and it's open to students. So many of the members who sign up are undergraduate and graduate students.
So one of the questions that I think people might ask is, why should scientists even care about nuclear issues? We always hear that science is pure. We do our research. Why should we care about politics? Why should we care about weapons?
This is a very good question, in particular as many scientists have not really learned how to communicate with the public or with political leaders. This is very difficult. They don't share the same level of technical insight that we have, and therefore it's difficult to communicate. But I think we have to realize that science has advanced to a stage where its applications have extremely far-reaching societal impact. And it's very important that the people who make decisions on how to use the applications of science have a foundational knowledge of the science and then the impacts these applications have. We could mention a couple examples if that's helpful.
That'd be great, yeah.
So I think nuclear war has a massive impact. I believe most people have seen pictures of Hiroshima and are aware that even a small nuclear weapon instantaneously can kill tens of thousands of people. But they may know less what the impact of a large-scale nuclear war would be on things like climate. It turns out that even a limited nuclear war, say between Pakistan and India, would impact the climate to a point that it would lead to significant food insecurity in large parts of the world through a phenomena that we call nuclear winter. Basically, massive amounts of soot being projected into the atmosphere, distributing around the world, and reducing the solar heating. And I think it's very important for politicians to know. I think one thing I've heard historically, Gorbachev, prior to the meeting in Reykjavik with Reagan, where they almost agreed to massively reduce nuclear weapons, he basically learned from scientists as he became the president of the Soviet Union about nuclear winter, and that had a profound impact on the actions that he took.
When you say a limited nuclear war, how many weapons or what kind of kilotons are we talking about?
So I think this particular study that I'm thinking of is a study by Alan Robock. He's a climate scientist at Rutgers University. He's also a member of this APS coalition. And I think he's assuming 15 kiloton weapons, both on the Pakistani and Indian side. And then it also very much depends on how these weapons are used. If they're used against metropolitan areas with a lot of combustible materials, more soot will be transferred into the atmosphere. So this is the particular scenario he has looked at.
So that's one weapon each only?
50 weapons on both sides.
Oh,
and
okay.
Each of these 50 weapons would have 15 kilotons.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you call that limited, right?
Yes.
But to the average person, that's 100 nuclear weapons.
It's 100 times Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
Right. So
yes.
That doesn't sound limited.
It's limited against the background of the American and the Russian arsenals, which are far greater.
So how big are the Russian and U.S. arsenals?
So I think I want to focus on the strategic arsenals that
Okay.
sit on intercontinental ballistic missile systems
Okay.
and are designed to strike against the adversary's home country.
Okay.
And so these numbers are regulated by the New START Treaty, and presently each side has 1,550 warheads.
Each side.
Each side.
Okay. So
And
that's over 3,000 total.
that is over 3,000 total. That is correct. And maybe to put this in perspective, so in the case of the limited war, the so-called limited war between India and Pakistan, the temperature here in the Midwest would drop perhaps by 1.5 degrees in centigrades. So say 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if there was an all-out war, Grosse also has done simulations on this. I believe one simulation I seem to recall is 1,000 weapons on each side, so 20 times the number of weapons. In addition, these are thermonuclear weapons, so the yield is higher, but I think he does a fairly conservative assumption. They are 150 kilotons, so each weapon is 10 times Hiroshima. So in that case, the temperature here in the Midwest, I think, would drop of the order of 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And it would do this for the better part of a decade. So very roughly, if there was such a war, it would stop agriculture on the Northern Hemisphere for a decade. So it would be really absolutely devastating and would not allow a continuation of American or Russian society.
Sorry, I'm just sitting here in disbelief because what a lot of people always concentrate on when you talk about nuclear war is just surviving the minutes after war.
Yes.
Right? So how are you going to survive the blast?
Yes.
But what you're talking about is how are we going to survive in a decade?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which now you're talking about we're not even going to be able to have food.
That is correct. So I think it is generally believed if there was an all-out nuclear war, as high as the immediate casualties are, estimates are that in the United States, between 50 to 60 million people would die in the immediate attack. But it is still true that the long-term fatalities would be far greater. And there's actually maybe two things we should mention concretely. Mm-hmm. One is the impact on climate and food insecurity that would result. But we also should talk about radioactive fallout. And it is believed that in such a war, a primary target would be nuclear assets, military assets. And the way they are stationed in the United States, look at the ballistic missile silos in the Northwest, that would generate fallout plumes that basically stretch over the Midwest into the East Coast. It would require the evacuation of large cities, including Chicago. You could not hope to survive in vast areas of the Midwest, the radiation sickness that would follow from this fallout. So the consequences are just beyond imagination.
But where would all these people go?
There's no place for them to go. There's no good solution to this.
Because all of these missile sites are they're in North and South Dakota, they're in Missouri. And if you say even, as far east as Chicago is going to have to evacuate, yes. I don't know how. I mean, you have 7 minutes to?
Oh, no. I mean, it would take, this is the fallout that's produced and transported into the atmosphere in the aftermath of the explosion. And then it would travel downwind. So I think the timescale to evacuate is days or maybe a week. It depends very much on weather. It also depends on whether, at that point in time, Chicago is downwind of one of these missile sites that is being hit. Lots of uncertainty. I'm just picking a scenario.
Yeah, but you're still trying to evacuate millions of people.
You would have to evacuate millions of people.
In a short period of time, which we already see doesn't work very well.
Yes. And it's maybe interesting to think about this. These are people who, at least in part, already have been affected. So they may have been subject to radioactive fallout. Let's say some people arrive here in La Crosse, but who's going to shelter them if they are contaminated? People also may be just not able to assist them. They may already show serious signs of radiation sickness, or if they were close to the blast, they may have severe burns. There will be not the capacity needed to treat and take care of the victims of such an attack properly.
And I think the last couple of years have shown us how easily our hospitals can become overwhelmed.
Yes, that definitely would be the case. One thing that's generally said is such an all-out nuclear war would destroy the social fabric of our country, meaning the infrastructure that is meant to deal with emergencies would be basically not capable of doing this, and in large parts it would be destroyed.
So I think the only solution is to prevent a nuclear war.
Yes, all-out nuclear war must not happen. This is the ultimate catastrophe.
I think we should also stop, limited nuclear war.
And this is, I think, the more concrete danger. So it could be that, to stay with this example, over a conventional conflict in Kashmir, there is an escalation. And people may not realize that this already has severe worldwide consequences.
I think that's true because there's a lot of talk about tactical nuclear weapons as well. Do you think that is dangerous rhetoric?
So you mean in context of the Ukrainian situation now, or in general?
In general.
Yeah, I think that tactical nuclear weapons are a pathway how to escalate a conventional conflict into an all-out nuclear war. So once the threshold to a nuclear conflict is passed, I think the additional step to take this to strategic weapon is smaller. So I think that this is one of the reasons why the United States has significantly reduced its arsenal of tactical weapons many years ago.
What does the coalition see as a path forward to reducing the threat of nuclear war?
I think that the coalition advocates for arms control. I think there are several avenues that are important. I think bilateral or trilateral treaties between Russia, the United States, and China are important. I think personally that one good goal would be to reduce arsenals to a threshold below where one might survive as a society, at least, despite the tremendous costs. Then I think another aspect is non-proliferation, making sure that there are no additional nuclear weapon states, and also making sure that the existing arsenals and the materials that are needed and the technologies that are needed to manufacture nuclear weapons are well guarded and are not accessible to non-state actors. I think one significant risk is also the possibility that one day we might see a nuclear terror attack. It's nothing immediate, but clearly we cannot rule out that there are terror organizations that aim to acquire nuclear weapons.
Do you think that's a likely scenario?
Well, I believe we know that certain organizations like Al-Qaeda have tried to acquire weapons or at least materials. I think that it is extremely difficult for terror organizations. They do not have the know-how. I think they have to purchase technicians, engineers, and physicists. They have to find people who would sell themselves out to do something that ethically is really very questionable. So all of this is very difficult. But we should see it against the background of the history where nuclear powers have fallen apart and destabilized, such as the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union, there were thousands of scientists and technicians who had to struggle to feed their families. Mm-hmm. And we believe that some of them were approached, but I think they did not follow any of these temptations, as far as we know. The United States and its allies worked very hard to prevent this from happening. One personal memory I have is both at CERN, the European Lab for Particle Physics, and also at Brookhaven National Lab, where I did experiments. The number of Russian scientists went up significantly after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think these were programs to bring Russian scientists to Western labs to pay them a decent salary so that they could support their families at home and would be less vulnerable to temptations to sell out their know-how.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about, since you brought up the fall of the Soviet Union, is I know there's been a lot of talk in the papers about Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons. And I know that that had to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And, Ukraine pretty much overnight became the custodian of many of the Soviet nuclear weapons. Do you know anything about the history there or what happened?
We can go through it briefly. So
that'd be great.
After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Ukrainian arsenal was roughly 5,000 warheads. It was the third largest nuclear power, well ahead of China or the United Kingdom or France. And the question was in general what to do with the arsenals that were Soviet and now ended up in Soviet republics. There also were arsenals in Belarus and in Kazakhstan. And this was subject to a treaty, I think, that was negotiated in Lisbon, the so-called Lisbon Protocol, that I think went into force in 1993, where it was decided that Russia is the successor to the Soviet Union in terms of the nuclear arsenals, also in terms of the bilateral treaties that the Soviet Union had with the United States with regards to nuclear arms control. Now, already at the time, it was realized that this would remove the nuclear deterrent that the Ukraine had, and there were voices both in the Ukraine as well as abroad that warned against this step, that there may be a day coming where Ukraine really needs this nuclear deterrent so that they can fend off a Russian aggression. And in order to address this concern, there is the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which the signatories of this, the United States, the Ukraine, Russia, and the United Kingdom, where the three nuclear powers give security guarantees to Ukraine, basically promising to protect the integrity of their borders. And this is what the Ukraine settled with and then willingly turned over their nuclear arsenal to Russia. And so did Kazakhstan and Belarus. Now, 20 years later, in 2014, Russia then took Crimea, a part of Ukraine, by force, as we know, and they started also the conflict in eastern Ukraine that now is dramatically escalating with Russian forces really attempting, it seems, a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine.
So are we still bound by the Budapest Memorandum to protect the borders if there's nuclear conflict?
I think that the United States would have been bound, but my view is that we basically failed in 2014 to act on the Budapest Memorandum, and so did the UK. And of course, this is not to say that it's not Russia's fault to violate this agreement really badly.
Did Ukraine and the other former Soviet countries receive anything for the nuclear weapons? Were they paid to remove them?
Not to my knowledge, but I don't know with certainty. So that's an interesting question because generally speaking, nuclear arsenals are very expensive. So I think a country that has no need to have nuclear weapons, a security-related need, probably would voluntarily try to get rid of their nuclear weapons. So even if one starts with an arsenal of nuclear weapons need to be maintained and they also need to be kept safe. And all of this is really very expensive.
I can imagine that the rest of the world was pretty concerned when former Soviet countries suddenly had large nuclear arsenals and no way to upkeep them.
Yes, and to protect them.
And to protect them,
Yeah.
that they would fall into the wrong hands.
Yes, and thinking about this, one thing are the nuclear weapons that at least are somewhere on military sites, and military sites have some level of protection. But there's also lots of industries that feed this nuclear weapons complex and that have nuclear materials, fissile materials on site, or technologies, all of which have to be protected. And there were hundreds such sites through former Soviet republics that all of a sudden were not protected properly. I believe with regards to the danger that nuclear materials or technologies could fall into terrorist hands, this was the most critical period so far in history.
I want to go back to our nuclear weapons and the Russians' nuclear weapons. You talked about we have about 1,550 each on ballistic missiles. Are these always on alert, or are there different levels of alert?
There are different levels of alert. So it depends a little bit on what weapon system we are looking at. There's a subset of weapons that are on hair trigger alert, you might say. So they are ready to launch within minutes after a presidential order. And I believe it's thought that both in the United States and in Russia, this is about 900 weapons. And then I think these are mostly the weapons in silos and also on submarines, but not so much the bomber force. But one can heighten the alert level for bombers by, for example, arming them by loading the cruise missiles or bombs, whatever they are armed with, and having the crews alert ready. This might be the sort of thing that's happening in Russia after President Putin mentioned that he is increasing the alert readiness of the deterrent force of the Russian Federation.
So you mentioned nuclear weapons treaties. Are there any in particular that you think people should be advocating for?
So I think one important thing that happened early in the new administration, the Biden administration, is that the New START Treaty was extended. The New START Treaty went into effect in 2011. It asked both sides to reduce their strategic weapons to 1,550. It came with a sort of automatic possibility to extend by another 5 years. And that happened February 21, after the Biden administration had come into power. And I think it will be important to extend this. I think it has to be renegotiated. There's not an automatic renewal foreseen, as far as I know. And it would be a good goal to further reduce the number of strategic warheads. Then I think one thing I'd like to mention in context with the crisis in Ukraine,
Yes.
I think it would be very important to find a new version of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty. Maybe I describe briefly what that was.
Please.
So this is a treaty that was negotiated between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the mid-1980s. And it was a response to a situation where new fast medium-range missiles on the Soviet side, the SS-20, and on the Western side, the Pershing, were found to be very destabilizing. I think the Soviet Union had stationed SS-20s, medium-range missiles, and then Western European allies were concerned that this is an attempt to decouple Western Europe from the American nuclear deterrent. So if the Soviet Union threatens Western Europe with a clear impossibility that these missiles would reach the United States, that the United States then may be not willing to escalate this to a global strategic nuclear war, where it would use its intercontinental ballistic missiles. So I think actually the German chancellor at the time, Helmut Schmidt, took a lead in NATO asking the American allies of the Western Europeans to station a medium-range missile in Europe to counter this threat. That occurred, and it then was quickly realized that this is very destabilizing. A Pershing missile can reach Moscow in 10, 15 minutes, so it can be seen as a first strike weapon. And I think this is exactly how this was seen on the Soviet side. And both sides realized that this is not a good situation, that the risk of escalation had increased dramatically, and then very quickly agreed to eliminate these weapons. So the INF Treaty actually eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons, and I think it's sort of a historic success in nuclear arms control. And this fell apart in I almost would have said during the Trump administration, but I think this started earlier. The strategic situation in Russia has changed. It may have to look eastward. It may actually need such weapon systems, and it has started to develop such weapon systems, some fast, medium-range cruise missile. And the United States and its allies had noted early that this is in violation of the INF Treaty. And then during the Trump administration, that led to the United States leaving the INF Treaty. And then Russia left. And I think this now is very relevant in context with the situation in Ukraine, because one complaint that Russia has is if the Ukraine or NATO would station nuclear-armed medium-range missiles in Ukraine, then it's just under 10 minutes flight to Moscow or other command centers in Russia. And so that is a security concern that probably should be addressed. And a part of a solution to the Ukrainian crisis could be a new version of the INF Treaty. And one thing that I haven't seen discussed but should be entering this equation is actually also a threat that Russia poses towards Western Europe. Kaliningrad, former East Prussia, is still part of Russia. And I think Russia has stationed nuclear-armed ballistic missiles there. And that is very close to Berlin or to Warsaw. So I think there could be a treaty that bans nuclear armament from certain regions in Eastern Europe to reduce the danger of a nuclear first strike that seeks to decapitate the opponent.
The comments from Russia about having nuclear weapons in Ukraine makes a lot more sense now since you mentioned the INF and the disintegration of the INF, because I wondered why they would even be concerned about that. But if the treaty was still in place, then perhaps they wouldn't be as concerned. But because it's no longer in place, then that is a real concern of theirs.
It's a real concern of theirs, but I think one realistically also has to see that the INF is gone is of their choosing as well.
Right. So this is a chance then for all parties to renegotiate the INF to help kind of ease the fears.
I think so. I'm a physicist, not really an expert on the political science side, but it seems to me if there will be a deal on Ukraine, there needs to be something for Putin or the Russian side to show. And an INF treaty is something that NATO, I think, should be able to give them easily. This would not compromise the autonomy and the rights of the people of the Ukraine. Many other Russian demands obviously will directly infringe on the rights of the citizens of Ukraine and are much more difficult to meet.
You mentioned that, I mean, you're a physicist and you know, the coalition is a coalition of physicists and, you know, we're not political scientists. So what is the importance then of having our voices in the conversation?
I think that the political decision processes need to be informed in the science that underlies, in this case, nuclear weapons. We can go back to what we discussed on fallout. it turns out that the nuclear assets of the United States are positioned in a way that Russian first strike on them basically would cover maybe half of the country with fallout patterns if the weather is not favorable, so that it had to be evacuated. Clearly, in the process that led to the stationing of these nuclear assets, there was no input from scientists. This is totally driven by congressional delegations pulling in funds into their rural areas. I think there is obviously no thought how to keep the United States safe from the consequences that nuclear war would have. It's just one example how I think it's very important for the political decision process to be informed. And in my view, it has to be informed at least two levels. The decision makers themselves have to be informed, but our decision makers are much less free than we often think, in my view. There's a lot of populism, and this wields real power. Politicians can't really act against public opinion in a democracy. So without informing the public opinion, there will be no responsible decisions. And I think the scientific community is the place that has the information, and we have to make the effort to reach out to the public so that there's some understanding there. And then we also have to reach out to political decision makers. And I should say this is not a new idea. I think the United States has a great tradition on basing decisions on science. And there are various tools. One tool I find very impressive is the Congressional Research Service. This is a source of really excellent information for members of Congress. And one thing I find interesting there, if you read a CRS, Congressional Research Service paper, say on the Iran nuclear deal or on the INF treaty, it usually is a collaborative effort by authors that have backgrounds in political science, in maybe physics or in engineering, depending on what the topic is. So one reason for scientists to make their voice heard is also the fact that nuclear weapons, arms control, consequences of nuclear war, this is highly interdisciplinary and requires collaboration between fields to really understand what's going on and what the consequences are.
So we can be scientists and activists.
So, wow, this is an interesting question. So I'm not sure I know the answer if it's good for us to be activists. So I think it's, and this has to do, I think, with our current situation of being so polarized. As soon as we are activists, we belong to a camp. And then the other side will not hear us. So I think at least some of us have to be really very neutral. And of course, we can be Democrats or Republicans. We have the same rights as everyone. But in some of our public communication, this should be not visible. I think it's very important that science maintains objectivity and can be perceived by people from all backgrounds as being an attempt to provide objective information that does not come with a certain political position. It's fine for all of us to have a political position and preferences and maybe to have not the highest opinion of someone else. But as scientists, I think it's also important that we inform in a neutral way.
So the coalition for the APS then is not an activist organization. It's an information coalition.
So I'm not sure this is really decided. I actually believe that different members may have different views on this. But I believe that it's largely providing objective information. And then sometimes it may be difficult to hide where you're coming from. But I believe that makes it easier to be heard on all sides.
It's interesting you say that because I served a few years on CIFS, the Committee for International Freedom of Scientists, and it was a very similar situation.
I believe it. And
so that kind of goes to my next question, which is there is a movement in the world about going to zero, meaning taking our nuclear weapons and saying, okay, as a world, we're going to eliminate all nuclear weapons. Is that something that the coalition has discussed advocating for?
The coalition has discussed advocating for this, and I believe that there is not a uniform position. Obviously, the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons is something that's worthwhile supporting, but one has to, I think, also weigh in real-world boundary conditions. I think it's definitely a goal to work towards, but I think recent events may show us that one has to be very careful in how one goes about this. So I think it is not clear that all players are always well-intended, and I think the United States needs to maintain an arsenal that can deter players that have early tensions. And it hurts me a little bit to say this because
it sounded like it.
Yeah, in principle, it's a really terrible threat. And one way I'm thinking about this, whatever technology you have, there's always a probability that it fails. So two probabilities we can ask for nuclear arsenals. What is the probability for accidental nuclear war? What is the probability that a terrorist organization may get a hold of a nuclear weapon? And it is clear that everyone responsible works extremely hard to make these probabilities as small as possible, but they're not zero. We drive our cars, even though we know there's a non-zero probability that we have a fatal accident. The same is true for planes or nuclear power plants. I believe the nuclear accidents that we have seen, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, that roughly occurs at the rate we expect, given the small probability that the technology has a failure. And the probabilities, I think, here for accidental nuclear war are even smaller, but the important thing is they are not zero. And if nuclear arms stay with us for eternity, you somehow have to multiply time with probability. We cannot exclude that there will be a serious unforeseen nuclear event that may take place at some point in the future.
Do you find it a little surprising that we haven't had an unforeseen nuclear event?
No, I think people largely are responsible, and also they are not suicidal. So we talked about the nuclear winter. I think take Russia. Even if Putin, for some reason, should have changed into an irrational player, I believe he does know that a full attack on the United States is basically suicidal, and not just because the United States strikes back, but also for the climate impact.
What about some sort of accidental release? Not that someone would order it, but that a bomb would accidentally be launched or would drop from a plane or some sort of technical accident.
I think that the biggest challenge could arise from an early warning system. Mm-hmm. In particular, if the country that's attacked has a policy where they would launch a counterattack during the attack. One of the most important things to agree upon would be to wait with a return strike, a second strike, until the incoming missiles basically have been received and have done their damage, so that one can be absolutely sure that one is actually subject to an attack and not a false warning of an early warning system.
But isn't that dangerous for the country being attacked? Because most likely those missiles would be launched at your missiles.
They would, yes.
So then you wouldn't be able to counter-strike.
Well, it depends. The United States has a triad, so does Russia, and the systems are vulnerable at different levels. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the bomber they could try to launch, and then one has hours before one really makes a decision. Some of the assets would probably not come off the ground, but some would. But then very importantly, the naval leg of the triad, the nuclear-armed submarines, they presently are still not very vulnerable. They would survive a first strike, and they have plenty of capability to deliver damage that is unacceptable to any country around the world.
Which goes to my question of, if we remove first strike, so if we commit to no first strike, do we need our land-based nuclear leg?
So there are split opinions on this. After what I told you about fallout, in my opinion, it's ill-advised to have this leg. I think there are a broad range of opinions on this. I think some have to do with strategic considerations that I may not follow. Others may be as simple as having systems in all legs of the military services, Air Force and Navy.
Those sound like political decisions.
I think they are political decisions. I think
there's also, of course, the political decision of making sure that you have jobs in your district.
That definitely will play a role in that too, yes. But again, I'm not a political scientist. But as a physicist, it seems to me that a submarine force is a very secure second strike arsenal, and should be at least very strong, and may make it less necessary to have land-based ballistic missiles. And then one thing I like about the bombers is that once they are airborne, they are also safe, and there's lots of time to make a well-reasoned decision before one really has to decide to counterstrike.
And that is key, right? Not to make a rash decision.
I believe that is key. I think arms control should always aim to buy time, to not be forced to make a quick decision based on incomplete or less than perfect information.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to cover?
I think we could talk a little bit about the Iran nuclear deal, but given the situation in Ukraine, this is less in the foreground. But I find it very interesting to observe that the negotiations are still ongoing in Vienna with active Russian and Chinese and American participation.
Wait, they're still ongoing? I didn't even notice.
Yeah, they are still ongoing. So there's an attempt to have the United States rejoin the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran nuclear deal. And what I find interesting about this, it just indicates how important all sides see non-proliferation as an important goal. So despite this really extreme conflict between Russia and the United States and its Western allies, they still agree to try to get this agreement back into force to
right.
make sure that there's no proliferation to Iran of nuclear weapons.
Right. That is, I mean, just the sanctions against Russia, but we're all at the table.
Yes, and for the Iran nuclear deal, everyone is at a table right now. I think
that does say something.
Yeah, both the French president and the German chancellor just said this week that it's very urgent to try to arrive at an agreement there. And I believe that the Russians have been quite helpful in making progress. So that is interesting. I'm not sure I know enough of the details, but one challenge is that Iran has ejected the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, from Iran. One of the most important benefits of the Iran nuclear deal is that the IAEA was able to send inspectors into Iran. They use very advanced technology to monitor the nuclear program there and, of course, everywhere else in the world. And that was useful because we had a really good picture of what was going on in Iran. But then over the withdrawal of the United States, Iran stepwise withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. And about a year ago, they ejected all the inspectors. So we basically have been blind ever since. And one big challenge in renegotiating the deal is how can we trust Iran with what steps they took in the meantime? And this is basically the argument that Macron and Scholz have put forward this week, and others, of course, as well, that one has to move soon and try to restore this monitoring.
During the JCPOA, Iran was the most monitored nuclear site in the world. We had so much information.
It definitely was, yes. I think there were 170 inspectors.
So I guess a lot of people lost a job when the JCPOA
I'm not sure if they lost a job. I think that the IAEA is actually underfunded and very busy. I think there's maybe worldwide about 900 sites that they have to inspect regularly. And I think they were struggling with taking on this additional workload in Iran.
So that's good. Other people get inspected now.
So sometimes what's stated is, that we are sort of one-sided or come down heavy-handedly just on Iran. But I don't think that is true. I think in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, all the countries that are signatories have a so-called safeguard agreement with the IAEA, and they're all being monitored, be it an enrichment facility in the Netherlands or a centrifuge plant in Iran. I think they all will be monitored.
Is the U.S. a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
The United States is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it is a so-called nuclear weapon state. So there's no point in monitoring facilities here. So when the NPT was negotiated in the second half of the 60s, the situation was that there were 5 nuclear weapon states, the P5, Soviet Union, United States, UK, France, China. And the question was, how do we prevent proliferation to other countries? And at the same time, how do we make nuclear technologies available for civilian use to other countries? There are enormous benefits of nuclear power. And there was clearly not a solution that unilaterally the P5 could have declared use the nuclear superiority that we have to prevent everyone else. So the NPT is a deal where all other countries that were not nuclear join and say we actually commit to not developing nuclear weapons. And in return, the P5 through the IAEA have agreed to make technologies and materials available for civilian use. But that regime requires very close monitoring in all the non-weapon states.
Wasn't part of that treaty also that the P5 would disarm?
Well, it's in the preamble, I believe, but it's not mandatory. There's every 5 years an NPT review conference, and the other members usually complain that the United States and Russia do not follow the spirit of the preamble properly. Others would like to see more progress in the disarmament. Yeah, definitely.
There is a nuclear treaty, I forget which one, that the U.S. has not signed on to.
You may refer to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, yes.
Yes. So the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has not been ratified by the U.S.
correct,
Senate.
yes.
The United States obeys by its by the treaty, by its rules. I think the United States has signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but to make it really a binding treaty, it needs to go through the ratification process, and that has not happened. And I think to ratify a treaty requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and there is a sufficient number of senators who have concerns that the United States should not give up the ability to test if this should be ever necessary or in the interests of the United States.
As a physicist, I think this is something you can talk about, which is why would we need to test again?
Yes. I can tell you my opinion. In my opinion, it would be an advantage for the United States if the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was in place and ratified in all countries. It basically provides a huge impediment to developing a new nuclear weapons program. Countries like the United States that have done a lot of testing have a huge wealth of test data from hundreds of tests that the United States carried out. And this test data, together with modern tools that we have, such as supercomputers, largely can be used to develop any new weapons technology that we want. It's not clear that testing is needed. But on the other hand, it's very clear that a newcomer like North Korea or Iran severely depends on testing. Mm-hmm. They do not have this data. They do not have the supercomputers. They have not developed the science at the same level. So it's actually a strategic advantage for the United States to enforce the treaty. And this is a good example how scientists can help with political decision processes. But this is something that's very difficult to sell. And I think it would be an advantage for the United States if the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was ratified. Mm-hmm.
So do we still build new nuclear weapons?
Well, yes, the United States does modernize its arsenal. For example, during the Trump administration, there were new warheads with adjustable yield, so that from a submarine, one could choose to carry out a tactical strike. I think this was in response to developments in Russia.
Wait, but that doesn't add to the number of weapons we have. So do they take one out of service to put a new one in?
So to say, I think they change a warhead on a Trident missile.
So again, that's not the spirit of the treaties, right? Like when we want to reduce the number of weapons, we're actually that's not kilotons. That's just like physical numbers. So we actually replace one mm-hmm. with another one that's a higher yield weapon.
Yeah, I think it's probably in compliance with the letter of the treaty, but not with the spirit. If the spirit of the treaty is to enhance trust between possible adversaries, to reduce a number of weapons, to decrease the likelihood of a nuclear escalation, then the introduction of these tactical weapons at least violates this last goal, namely, reducing the likelihood. I think tactical weapons are a stage, an escalation stage, going from conventional conflict to an all-out nuclear war.
So would it be beneficial? So I know we have all the old test data, and we have the supercomputers, but the weapons that we have now, aren't they far enough from the designs that we tested that it would be beneficial to test again to make sure that we haven't made a mistake?
So I'm not enough of an expert, but my understanding is that there's no need for the United States to test, even for developing new weapons.
Because I guess that's the argument I've heard, that we're far enough away that we've changed all the parts.
Yes.
That testing it would be advantageous because we've pretty much changed everything.
Yes. Well, there's also the aspect you can do non-critical testing. You can, for example, study an implosion mechanism experimentally. That's still allowed without a nuclear warhead without a plutonium pit being present. That is perfectly fine if there's some unexpected challenge that you want to study experimentally. But I have not heard anyone making a strong case why a full-scale nuclear test is necessary for the United States.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you to Matthias for his time. If the episode sounded a little different to you, that is because this is the first time that I actually sat in a room with a physical person and recorded the podcast. Hopefully, I'll be able to do more of that in the future. The next episode will be available at the end of the month as regularly scheduled. If you would like to send us a comment or a question, please use mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. To help others find us, leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.